Hello Newsies. For those of you who don't know, my name is Stephen Garland and I teach English at Belleville West High School. Today I'll be walking you through how to format a story for high news. Now, before we get into the actual nuts and bolts of the format, I want to really emphasize how important a good, informative interview is for your story. So most stories really rely heavily on the quotes that you gather before you begin to write. As a reporter, your job is to gather up all of the information you can about your given topic and then to relate it to your reader in a way that is straightforward, interesting, and easy to understand without, talking down to your reader. The most effective way to gather information for a story and end up with a great quote is to conduct meaningful interviews with as many people as possible. If you've already watched Nyla's video on how to conduct an interview, then you have an idea of what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I highly recommend you check that out soon because, it's pretty invaluable. Make sure you go into interviews with plenty of questions you imagine your readers may have. If your subject references something you don't know about or you'd need to explain in the article for clarity reasons, make sure you ask follow-up questions too. You aren't expected to be an expert on the topic you're reporting, but you are, however, expected to talk to experts and get as much information as you can from them so your readers can be better informed. Once you have all the quotes that you'll need for your story, you're going to want to sit down and organize those quotes into an informative, write-up. To help with that organization, you've been provided with 3 versions of what we call the LQTQ Chart. One version is blank for you to practice with. The second has each section filled in with the explanation for what that section should do. And then the third example breaks down an already existing story so you can kind of see what it would look like in practice. Some people use the LQTQ chart when they write. This brings us to the format. Now, I said LQTQ. Let's go over what that stands for. The L stands for lead. Now, I've seen that spelled both L-E-A-D and L-E-D-E, but either way, when it comes to news writing, the lead is the first sentence or sentences of a story, and it essentially gives away any big information that your story will elaborate on. So don't hide anything. Remember that we're not writing a mystery story. Your reader should be able to tell just by reading the headline that your editor will write and your lead whether they want to continue reading the story or not. If your topic is interesting and your lead is written in a way that will encourage them to find out more, you've done very well. That's your only expectation when it comes to lead. Here are some examples of great leads and why they are leads. So I'm going to kind of walk you through and talk that out. All right. So as you look at a few stories from NPR to kind of give you a good example of what a good lead is, we're going to start with this article from July 17th about the opioid crisis. Now, you can tell from the headline that it's about opioid prescriptions and overprescribing of them, but then we go down to the lead and it reads as such. So it says, despite widespread devastation caused by America's opioid epidemic, an investigation by NPR found that doctors and other healthcare providers still prescribe highly addictive pain medications at rates widely considered unsafe. So you'll notice a few things about this specific lead. It's 1 sentence long, and it tells you that the story is mostly going to be about the investigation that NPR did itself about the overprescription of these drugs. Now, when you're looking at a news story, you'll notice that no paragraph is very long. As a matter of fact, you want to keep it between 1 and 3 sentences at almost all times. So keeping it as short as possible is best case scenario. We also have a character count that sometimes we try to keep for a lead. But this is a decent sized lead. This is about the size that you're shooting for. Now, in the next one, we have a story called Congressional Democrats Demand White House Restore Hospital Data Collection to CDC, which is a new and ongoing story. So this will be developing
as legislation goes back and forth. And then we have the lead that reads, Senate and House Democrats sent letters to the White House Friday asking the Trump administration to reverse its decision to sidestep the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in collecting COVID-19 hospital data. So this doesn't exactly give you much new information right off the bat. It does tell you where the story is at currently. So if you want to read more about this particular topic, you can, but you do not have to continue reading if you feel like you know everything that you need to know about the story, where it is. And that's kind of typical for developing stories too. You know, like if you've already read this update, you're probably not going to be finding anything new in this particular story, but it exists and you can check it out. And then we have this story about flooding in a region of India called Assam. And, you know, like they have great images to go along with it too. But one thing that I wanted to point out is this is kind of a longer lead than you would normally see. And I can give you some time to read that over. But the idea here is this is a lot of information. It's a world news story. So again, there's an even lower threshold for what you are assuming your readers know. But they're giving you as much as possible in this first paragraph. You also notice the next paragraph is even longer. It's an additional information paragraph, and it has more specific information before they start using source material.
We'll practice lead writing specifically in a future video, so don't worry about doing it perfectly right from the start. Both of the Qs stand for quote in the LQTQ format, and this is where your story will become fairly simple to plan out. After your lead, you will alternate between a quote from a source and a transitional paragraph. You can also transition between your lead and your first quote, and you certainly should do so if you need to give more information before you jump into the story. But please remember that your lead should have all the high priority information. Don't save that for later on in the story. And don't save juicy bits of the story unless those come in the form of quotes, which you can't put in your lead. So, that's what you need to plan out. Transitional paragraphs can serve several functions in your story. They may clarify a previous quote, define terms that the reader may not know, or introduce the topic of the next quote as you make your way through your story. I like to think of transitions as a way to fill in the blanks that your quotes don't quite cover. If you've done proper interviews, you probably won't have a lot of blanks in your story, but clarifying information is just as important. You can't always assume the knowledge that your reader is bringing to the story, so give them as much information as you possibly can. For the remainder of the story, you'll alternate between transitions and quotes until you reach the end. Be careful to always put a transition in between quote paragraphs, even when both quotes are by the same speaker. Two quote paragraphs back to back is called a stacked quote, and that's considered an error in AP style writing, which is what we're doing for the newspaper and how most newspapers operate. If you're having trouble transitioning between quotes, be sure to reach out to your editor or me before submitting the story, and we can help bridge the gap. It's a lot easier to do it while you're working on the story rather than later on.
The next thing I wanted to show you is our LQTQ format. So this is the document that I will have shared with you that kind of breaks down each section into its components so that you can kind of see how a newspaper story gets put together once you have all the information that you need. You'll notice that there is an additional information section which tells you to put important information not found in the lead. And then you have direct quote, transition, and that will continue on throughout the story. So what that looks like in practice is, for instance, we have this story here where the additional information that needs to be linked to this quote, and those links will continue all the way down, is after a long time, school nurse Emma Stilton died in a car accident in December. Part-time teacher aide Betty Figgs has been covering Stilton's responsibilities. Impressed with Figgs' competence, Reeves proposed keeping Figgs to avoid hiring a new nurse with the savings. Reeves wants to hire a new teacher, a move unanimously supported by teachers. And then we have this quote that states, we need all the help we can get reducing our numbers. So that is in direct reference to the move that would allow them to hire a new teacher because of this nursing position that they filled in a different way. So When you look through this, you'll notice that the transitions tend to set up the next quote. You definitely don't want your reader to be surprised by a quote or its relevance. So any relevance that they would need to know about needs to happen before you put the quote, not after. You can further explain a quote in a following transition, but don't go out of your way to just explain the previous quote and then drop a completely new quote about a new topic. Another example I wanted to show you when it comes to transitions is from the same article we looked at earlier about the opioid epidemic. So I'd like you to mostly pay attention between these two quotes. So we have a quote saying that we're 5% of the world's population, but consume 80% of the world's supply of opioids, which is like in and of itself insane. And then gives direct credit to the speaker of that quote, also says where they're from. You would only do this the very first time that you quoted a news source. After this, you just refer to the person by his or her last name. And if this were a longer quote, you'd also put all this information at the end of the first sentence, and then you'd start the next sentence of their quote in the same paragraph. You'd keep all that together. Now, this transition that I like a lot says, critics say the practice exposes tens of millions of patients each year to unnecessary risk of addiction. And then this quote is a quote talking about the criticism. So it's not just a handful of doctors doing it. We kind of all are. It's part of our culture that this is normal. So this is a critique of the overprescription of opioid drugs. This transition really sets you up to better understand the mood and tone of the quote that you're about to get. And then the transition right after even kind of better clarifies the doctor's position before moving on to a new subject area. You'll notice that this has a very clean like transition quote, transition format that we're going to try and practice and work through on our high news formatted stories.
At this point, all you have left to do is finish your story. The end of a story can look different depending on the topic, but we'll go over a couple of general ways to finish your story off. If it's about an upcoming event, the time and place of that event, as well as any contact information your reader may want, should go at the end of that story. So that needs to be, the last thing they read. The same goes for a continuing story with an upcoming edition. Make sure your reader knows when they need to be looking out for the update or the next piece in the series. Another popular way to end a story is with something we call a kicker quote. And this can be a lifesaver, as most new journalists really want to support the topic that they're talking about. So they want to promote it or say it's going to be a great time. And unfortunately, that's another AP error that's called editorializing. You have to remember that you're simply conveying information, and if you say that an event is going to be a great time in your own words, or encourage your readers to go out and attend something or other, you're essentially advertising for that group or that event, and that's when the topic of editorializing comes up. That's a major bias that we have to avoid. Fortunately, your interview can include questions like, is there anything you'd like prospective attendees to know? Or something that sounds more organic and less formal because you don't speak like I do. You'll likely receive a quote that does the same job you were trying to do as the reporter. So you can end the story with that quote of what they would want attendees to know. Kicker quotes don't have to be an encouragement to attend an event necessarily. They simply end a story in an organic way. However, when you get the itch to cheer on your topic, always look for a kicker quote. This way, the message will still be conveyed while you get to remain the unbiased reporter that your readers can really trust for information and rely on in that way.
All right. And then when we look at ways that you can end stories, we have a few different examples, and I'm going to go back to the stories that we kind of started using it as examples. So this first one is about the flooding in Assam in India. So this conclusion just runs, while floods are an annual occurrence in eastern India, rescue efforts have been complicated by the coronavirus pandemic this year. On Friday, India recorded its biggest spike so far in new infections, taking its total recorded caseload to over 1 million. So this is the ending of this particular story because it is added information. It is relevant to the story overall. However, this is a side fact. This is not directly related to the flooding or the immediate impact of the flooding, but rather about rescue efforts revolving around the flooding. And this is kind of a way to make it more relevant to the readers as well, since everybody is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic at this particular moment. So the reader will see this, the reader will understand why they're moving so slowly when it comes to, displacing over 1 million people for this flooding. Now, about the hospital data. This is the continuing story. This one is in flux, will likely be updated at least once before the end of the day, probably another story tomorrow morning as well. So this ending kind of leaves us a little bit hanging. Right now it says a hospital capacity dashboard maintained by the CDC and used by state epidemiologists for planning purposes went dark on Wednesday when the new system launched. It was restored late Thursday afternoon with data up to July 14th, the last day the CDC collected this information. It's unclear how the dashboard will be maintained going forward. So, in terms of the context of this whole story, this dashboard would be the only way that most citizens would have access to the CDC's information that it's getting about coronavirus cases. So, this is the natural way to end the story because this is the only thing that readers can really check on to see for themselves how this information is being stopped or changed in some way. So this is kind of the event format where it's like, for more information, go here. That's kind of the point of the ending of this particular story. And then when we get to the story about the opioid epidemic, we have exactly what I've been talking about, this kicker quote here. So the transition paragraph before talks about how a Stanford professor believes that Americans should be outraged about the opioid epidemic and how it's affecting millions of Americans right now. And so it ends with a quote from him that is quite emotional, that if you were a reporter writing this as a transition sentence, like this story would be sent back. You couldn't say this sentence, but he can because he's a source and he's a credentialed source. So he says they should be angry, and at least some of them are, particularly people who've buried loved ones. He says, it is remarkable that medicine still has the trust that it does after these past 20 years. So that's a pretty powerful quote. And I'm assuming that the writer put that at the end of the story to kind of convey the emotions behind the people who they asked about this particular topic. So to end the story with an emotional quote really adds a little bit of pathos to the story, but it also gives the speakers a chance to get their emotional information out when they've mostly been used for informational topics. So again, if you want information like this in your story, it needs to come from one of your sources, not from you. So if one of your sources is real fired up and you like one of their emotional, spicy, friendly, fun, welcoming quotes, whatever, you can absolutely use that as a kicker quote at the end of your story. Just please make sure this isn't your writing. You do not want to be the emotional aspect of your story. Otherwise, you've introduced so much bias that it won't be able to be printed. So just keep that in mind as you're putting together the ends of your stories. There are multiple ways to do it. A kicker quote is one way, and it kind of depends on the topic as to whether or not it's appropriate or inappropriate for you to use it. So good luck. That's it. You now know how to format your high news story. If you'd like some additional practice, I've provided some practice sheets that were used in past CISPA and IHSA journalism competitions. So you can go ahead and craft a lead, organize the quote, and add transitions and finish the story off however you think is appropriate. Remember to try and honor any word count you're given. And if you can't, remember that going over is always preferable to running short. It's just easier for your editor who didn't research the story like you did. So good luck, newsies. Thank you so much for looking this over. Please let me or your editor know if you have any questions about this or any other topic. And just thank you for everything you do to keep our newspaper interesting, current, and student-led.